It's Arsenal for Democracy, episode 345, recorded on January 26, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line this week from Idaho is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
We're going to be talking this week about the 1948 United Financial Employees strike on Wall Street. Recently on the show, we've talked about the post-war strike wave that rattled so many American elites in both parties, even if they had previously said they were supportive of unions. This led to the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, which we talked about in detail on episode 340, and that, of course, had a profoundly negative effect on unions, but we've noted that this did not immediately kill the union movement. In the spring of 1948, the union movement tried to press into the very heart of the capitalist system with a month-long strike of financial sector support staff and clerical workers on Wall Street who had been organizing since August 1946 during that nationwide wave of labor action in 1946. An earlier effort launched back in 1941 had been put on hold when the U.S. entered the war at the end of that year. Now, the stock markets, of course, had always depended on white-collar workers to keep track of all the papers and numbers and records and so forth. And again, here we're primarily talking about the supporting staff that keep everything running, as opposed to like the actual brokers in many cases, although I would imagine there was some blurring of some of the job responsibilities, especially if people were kind of working their way up the ladder, so to speak. But we're going to be focusing mostly on people who were doing those support functions. Listeners might remember the 1853 Herman Melville short story, Bartleby the Scrivener, A Story of Wall Street, which was about a hand copyist, known as a scrivener, who drives a Wall Street attorney to distraction by politely refusing to do any work or to vacate the premises. That story and kind of the elements that are discussed in passing in it basically marks a key distinction of the pre-Civil War era and post-Civil War era of American business and Wall Street and the various businesses around it. In that case, it's a firm that has business on Wall Street. In this case, we're talking about the actual stock exchanges and brokerage houses and things like that. Clerks, typists, and secretaries had been an especially prominent feature of stock exchanges on Wall Street since the late 1860s, which saw the proliferation of commercial typewriters, as we've talked about on our episode about the paperwork revolution and the clerical revolution, and the creation of the telegraph-based stock ticker also came in the late 1860s. In 1875, stenography was patented, creating another important clerical occupation at the Wall Street trading firms. Most of the people killed in the 1920 Wall Street bombing were clerks and stenographers at J.P. Morgan. This was also, as was the case by 1948, a mixed-gender union because there was a mix of genders in these jobs. There were some clerks that were pretty much all men up until the 1940s when you had women on the trading floor in various positions, including, I think, brokers, and that was presumably due to the war reducing the male labor force. But then you also had a lot of women who were serving as the stenographers and typists and so forth. Other sort of interesting side notes about the role of technology on Wall Street, and we're not going to get into the sort of computerization of Wall Street because that's after the era that we're talking about, but Thomas Edison's first power plant was built in 1892 on nearby Pearl Street to support more than 7,000 electric lamps on Wall Street. The New York Stock Exchange, built in 1903, was the first U.S. building to have air conditioning. And that is the site of a lot of what we're going to be talking about in today's episode. The conditions were not necessarily very good. A lot of the reason for this strike in 1948 that we're going to be talking about has to do with wage stagnation over the period of the Great Depression. But in general, the conditions could be kind of harsh. If there was a big rally or a bad crash day, all of these sort of clerical staff people would be expected to stay late after work to get all the paperwork handled before the next day of trading began. And if they made a mistake with all the handwritten figures, even if someone else had written illegibly and they had just copied that down incorrectly because they couldn't read it, then their pay could be docked heavily for that error. And that comes from a American Experience article from the PBS website. As usual, all of the articles will be up at arsenalfordemocracy.com with this episode that's going to be unlocked. It will also be up at the patreon.com/Arsenal for Democracy page. And once we go to locked episodes for that in a few weeks, the links will just be up at Patreon for that. But in 1948, according to an article from Forbes in 2011, the United Financial Employees Union went on strike against the New York Stock Exchange and the Curb Exchange, now known as the American Stock Exchange. This union, which represented many of the back office workers on Wall Street, was asking for higher wages for its members. The strike was also backed by the American Federation of Labor, which sent members of other unions to Wall Street to support. The demonstrators attempted to block the entrance to the exchanges and some other offices in the Wall Street area, and the protests soon turned violent, with dozens arrested by police. Now, Rachel, there was a great article, a little article in Financial History in the magazine in the spring of 2019 called The Battle of Wall Street, which talked about the strike and the particularly significant clash that became known as the Battle of Wall Street. So could you talk a little bit about how this strike emerged and what happened in 1948?
Yeah, so like you said, the pay was really stagnating. The the man who organized the workers, Merritt David Keefe, had started working on Wall Street in 1928 as a page boy for $15 per week. And after 13 years, his wages had only risen to $28 per week. So he organized the workers, and he founded the United Financial Employees Union in 1941. Like you said, World War II really interrupted these organization efforts. But after the war, they were able to continue their organizing the employees. So they attempted to organize all of the Wall Street exchanges, brokerage houses, and banks. So the union drive began in August of 1946. On August 14th, 1946, 700 New York Stock Exchange employees, which was 98% of the workers, staged a 2-hour walkout to show support for this unionizing drive in an unexpected display of strength. The UFE later grew to 5,000 and actually held majority membership at the New York Stock Exchange, the New York Curb Exchange, New York Cotton Exchange, and Wall Street's 5 largest brokerage houses. So prior to this, much like we spoke about on our last episode about organizing the seaports and getting kind of that industry-wide unionization, the brokerage houses and the different exchanges kind of pitted the workers against each other. They could simply reroute their trades through other firms, thus rendering an employee strike ineffective. So they really had to come together and actually take their grievances to the source and shut down trading, the New York Stock Exchange.
Originally, the union, the United Financial Employees, had tried to deal with the brokerage houses on a case-by-case basis and do sort of short strikes. And in March of 1947, a year before the big strike that we're going to be talking about, the UFE had organized a day-long strike at the Cotton Exchange, which, according to this article, raised tensions. But as Rachel said, because the companies could just route trades through other firms, going one by one to each of these brokerages wasn't really going to work as a long-term strategy, leading to the idea, especially because it had been relatively successful to do that initial strike, of going to the heart of it, shutting down the New York Stock Exchange and trying to, shut down all of the different exchanges at once and have a wider strike, which, as Rachel said, is analogous to the coast-wide 1934 West Coast ports strike.
In March 29th, 1948, 1,100 unionized employees of the New York Stock Exchange and the New York Curb Exchange joined in solidarity with 500 members of the Seafarers Union, and they walked out of their jobs. So this actually marked the beginning of the first and only multi-day strike in the histories of both of those exchanges. So it began on March 29th, 1948. The first day of protesting was peaceful. Shortly before 9 a.m. the next day, police approached picketers near the main entrance of the exchange and asked them to move due to a court order that limited picketing in that area. Claire Johnson, who was a 19-year-old secretary, refused and was subsequently arrested. Her arrest sparked outrage, and picketers swarmed the police. The violent scuffle lasted only 35 minutes. That's coming from the article. 35 minutes sounds like a pretty long, extended scuffle. And it resulted in 12 picketer injuries, including 2 hospitalizations, 2 police injuries, one of which was one officer was hit by another officer who mistook him for a picketer, and there were 45 arrests. So this fight became known as the Battle of Wall Street. So the New York Stock Exchange actually refused to budge from its pre-strike offer of a $3 to $5 raise, and they would not return to arbitration. The union did not see success with any of the other exchanges either. The exchanges had far greater financial resources than the union, and they actually just chose to wait out the strike, which officially ended on April 30th, 1948, just over a month after it began. The New York Stock Exchange workers ultimately accepted the terms of the pre-strike offer, but 100 workers' positions were eliminated during the strike. So basically the strike failed, and that was the only Wall Street strike. So it never got repeated. So something I mentioned was the Seafarers Union was also involved in this. And there's actually a Seafarers log archive on their website, seafarerslog.org, and they have a few photos up of the Seafarers Union members assisting in the strike. So there's a picture of Claire Johnson, the secretary who was first arrested and kind of kicked off the Battle of Wall Street. And there's also, like, you can see the seafarers carrying donated food, coffee for the picketers. So I think they were really brought in to protect the workers who were mostly white collar and probably didn't have a lot of experience striking. And they were also just big and burly, so they also provided protection against the pretty much inevitable police backlash. So they helped tend to the wounded. They kind of kept the picketers as safe as could be, while also providing material support in the form of like food and coffee and moral support as well.
So as you said, Rachel, the SIU, the Seafarers International Union, kind of an interesting union, and I think also has a good tie into our most recent episode, 344, about the West Coast ports strike, because what we had talked about in that one was that strike involved both dock workers and actual sailors. We mostly concentrated on the dock workers, the longshoremen and so forth themselves, but unionized sailors is something we should probably talk about at some point in more depth. The Seafarers International Union launched in 1938 and was an example of this. They represent, still to present day, although of course much reduced in size, U.S. and Canadian ship workers on the Great Lakes and inland waterways of that region of North America. Their focus is on safe working conditions and skills training for mariners working on U.S. and Canadian flagged vessels. As listeners probably know, international ocean shipping these days is now dominated by flags of convenience. I don't think that really lends itself to unionization, so that's sort of the distinction between these like inland freshwater mariners versus the overseas mariners. The SIU was the AFL's non-communist alternative to the CIO's communist-heavy National Maritime Union. The two, of course, merged in 2001, much like many of the former rival unions between the AFL and the CIO merged. In 1948, the CIO, however, was experiencing surging membership along the U.S. East Coast and the Gulf Coast, while the NMU under the CIO had begun to flounder after just having purged its communists that had made it so strong in the first place. So kind of an interesting historical context for the emergence of this strike. And they were particularly, the SIU was particularly active in New York at the time, and therefore it made sense for them to get involved with this other effort that the AFL was backing under the heading of the United Financial Employees. So, Rachel, I guess we'll get into takeaways here. This is obviously a shorter episode as there's not a whole lot of information on this strike, and it really was the only one. It was the first and last attempt to have a significant labor militancy of these back office workers on Wall Street. But I guess this isn't really something that I would have thought a whole lot about, and it's not. I mean, there's not even a Wikipedia article, I don't think, for this particular strike. What were your thoughts when reading about this?
Well, first of all, I guess I didn't really think about how Wall Street operated prior to today with like a lot of the automation and computerization of trading. But I guess if you just stop to think about it for a moment, obviously, if you're handwriting a whole bunch of trades, that requires a lot of people to keep the exchanges running and the brokerage houses running. And like, I guess, yeah, you just don't really think about it. And that being, it was like a heavily female profession, like especially the typists and like the stenographers and stuff, it kind of makes sense that that would be a sector of workers that would be underpaid and overworked. And there was actually like a stock photo showing clerks like on cots just laid out in rows just because they had to stay late to record all these exchanges. So there were really poor working conditions, kind of more
at
on
least
the
as far as white collar jobs
go.
Yeah,
On the white collar level versus the blue collar. But yeah, it seems like it was really stressful. And like you said, if they made mistakes writing down these exchanges, the clerks were fined like $5. And so looking at Keefe in the 1940s is only making $23 per week. So if he was getting fined for his errors, he was losing more than a day's wages for mistakes. So it was just very heavily scrutinized, underpaid, really poor working conditions. So it seems like it was a sector that was ripe for unionization. Another thing that surprised me is back in that 1946 walkout, 98% of the workers participated. And I think that's really unexpected. You don't really hear about that level of solidarity today. So it was really surprising to see that there was such high levels of membership. But when you're going up against Wall Street, the literal like temple of capital, it's not super surprising that Wall Street just basically chose to wait them out. They had all the power and the workers couldn't really come up against that even collectively just because the resource and the power differential.
Right. In some ways, this strike happens when it does because you have a bunch of people returning from World War II, coming back to their old jobs, finding that things still haven't really improved. You have the women who gained additional power during the war in maybe new jobs, and they're also interested in agitating for change and improvements to the conditions. So in many ways, you see this same pattern play out as every other sector of the American economy. But as you said, this is really the heart of the capitalist system. And while other economic sectors might have either been under pressure to meet some of these demands or had the resources to do so, it's not that they didn't have the resources to meet the demands. It's that, if anything, they were much, much better equipped in the immediate aftermath of the war to wait out these strikes, as you said, right? I mean, if you want to talk about the absolute pinnacle of power for Wall Street, financial institutions, brokerages, exchanges, banks, everything, you would look at probably the period of the late 1940s in the United States. London had been basically destroyed. Germany had been destroyed. You're not getting a whole lot of probably trading activity and so forth happening there relative to New York. The European economies largely completely bombed apart, had not had time to rebuild yet at this point. This is the peak of unchallenged American hegemony in the financial sector, and the recent rise of things like the Bretton Woods agreements and various other post-war financial agreements that really put the U.S. in pole position worldwide. And that is a very dangerous combination for the folks to go up against. And you have to wonder here, like, maybe they overplayed their hand in terms of going on a strike. Maybe they were, having relatively good success organizing the workers and getting, they were getting some raise agreements out of negotiations without going on strike. Maybe they should have just stuck with that, but it was probably hard in the moment, to see that, to decide, okay, we can't go further than this. As you said, Rachel, the success at the various firms, probably, in terms of going on walkouts and things like that, getting 98% participation, that probably encouraged a lot of like, oh, sure, we can do this. We'll just get everyone to go on strike and so forth. I think it's also interesting as well, especially given that these were white-collar workers, that the police were willing to just exercise pretty significant force against them. And maybe it was because of these sailors that were there as well to provide security that they were more willing to have these sort of violent clashes. But it does really seem like the sort of iron hand of capital was willing to come down pretty hard, because it was a direct threat to the capitalist institutions at the heart itself, as opposed to sort of the broader, peripheral of capitalism of, factories and things like that. So that was kind of my takeaway on this particular story.
Yeah, something else that I kind of wanted to highlight was just the unequal injuries on either side. So there were 12 picketer injuries and 2 police injuries. Like we kind of saw that talking about the dock workers strike. There were pretty heavy injuries and casualties on the striker side and very few on the police side. So in this case, there were 2 police injuries and one was a case of mistaken identity, basically. So I think that's something else I wanted to highlight. Just the fact that the police will really rally together to protect capital, and obviously this being Wall Street, there was a lot of symbolism in that, and so the police were probably pretty riled up by this threat to the capitalist system and this symbol of capitalism.
All right. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on the bonus episode this week to talk about the 1948 United Financial Employees strike on Wall Street.
Glad to be here.